The wasteland. A land forgotten and in ruin, reduced to a heap of broken images. Memory no longer lives here, its dirty streets stalked by dangerous mercenaries and lined with stalls where crooked peddlers sell indulgences. It was not always like this. Once upon a time, this wasteland was a glory to behold. But now overgrown and suffocating, even its ruins cannot remember what it once was. Unrecognizable, stifled under the muggy humidity of amnesia. And it has no idea what it will soon become, what its future holds. Renaski. Look now, the shadow of a man across the broken stone. Why is he here? Even his partner does not know. Cunning humanist, forever cloaked in secrecy. The inhabitants of this wretched place call him the Tuscan. The locals watch the pair during the day, their time divided. Sometimes they dig and move the earth, looking for buried treasure, the locals remark. Other times the man sits perched like a bird of prey, watching and tracing strange cryptic symbols in his journal. Day and night they haunt this wasteland, digging and studying, greedily surveying the ruins, ignorant to the dark clouds forming above. Florence. Standing in the cold shadow of one of the greatest cathedrals ever constructed. During the beginning of the 1400s, Florence would have looked very different to the city we know and love today. None of the famous architectural marvels that we now associate with the city existed then.
The dome of the infamous cathedral had yet to be built. The cathedral's baptistry lacked the famous classicizing doors, designed by Ghiberti, and the church of S. Maria Novella was without Leon Battista Alberti's harmonious, gracefully symmetrical facade. The convent of San Marco was not built, and the powerful families, the Medici, the Pitti, the Rucellai, had not yet built their grand classical palaces. Florence was, at this time, a walled medieval city, densely populated, its streets twisted, labyrinth lanes and alleys, towers rose and fortifications were abundant. This was soon to change, the same change that would go on to take place in the majority of every major European cities over the next few centuries.
After the Black Death of 1348 reduced Florence's population total by 80%, the city slowly started to make its recovery in the 1400s. Stirring from the ashes, until the humanist movement reignited its embers with passion and a thirst for enlightenment. They were obsessed with the idea of a lost, ancient civilization, that of the ancient Romans and Greeks. Florentine book hunters and other learned men let their imaginations run away with them. They were forever inventing spurious links between their city and ancient Rome. The Chronica de Origine Civitatis claimed that the city was founded by Julius Caesar. In Convivio, Dante called Florence that beautiful and famous daughter of Rome. Leonardo Bruni argued that Florence was not founded by Caesar, but Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The citizens of Florence saw ancient Roman ruins wherever they looked in their city, or so they believed. The fact is that Florence was not especially rich in Roman remains. And it's Rome itself that testifies to just how much the humanists were enamored by an idea of ancient Rome that did not correlate with reality, but was, in fact, a fantasy. For in the early 1400s, the eternal city, Rome, was, in most respects, a wretchedly uninspiring sight. All in all, it was a wasteland. The Temple of Jupiter was a dunghill, and both the Theatre of Pompeii and the Mausoleum of Augustus had become quarries from which the ancient masonry was scavenged, some of it for buildings as far away as Westminster Abbey. Many ancient statues lay in shards, half buried, while others had been burned in kilns to make quicklime, or else fertilizer for the feeble crops. The infamous Great Forum itself was buried in earth, and called the Campo Aquino, or the Field of Cows, a place where livestock grazed. Just like Florence, Rome in the early 1400s was not the Rome we know today. It was a decimated, dangerous, and uninviting city. The Black Death also hit Rome harder than it did Florence. What was once a bustling city was now reduced to a population of 20,000, from which, over the next 50 years, rose only slightly. Depopulation such as this would not only have left the survivors shell-shocked, initiating a kind of mass post-traumatic stress disorder, but would also have had a catastrophic impact upon the economic, political, and social framework of the time. But for a small handful of survivors, especially the elite nobility, depopulation had its perks and burgeoning opportunities. It was in the early 1400s that a very important man came to the wasteland we now know as Rome. This man was the architect of Florence Cathedral's dome, and the figure responsible for kick-starting the Renaissance's architectural revival of the ancient classical style of building, or, as his early biographer writes, his renewal of Roman masonry work. This man was Filippo Brunelleschi. History has immortalized Filippo as a great, innovative genius for his work on the cathedral's dome. But he was many things. He was an inventor, a clockmaker, sculptor, and pioneer of the linear perspective mode of drawing. But among these many great skills, he was also a very cunning man, and not to be slighted. For if so, he was apt to take his revenge.
In 1409, Brunelleschi was snubbed by a carpenter named Manetto. When he decided to not turn up to one of Brunelleschi's social gatherings. Never one to resist retaliation, Filippo resolved to exact his revenge for this perceived slight by persuading a wide cast of characters to convince Manetto that he had metamorphosed into someone else. This someone else was a well-known Florentine man named Matteo. As Manetto closed his shop one evening, Filippo raced ahead, picked the lock of the house, and barred the door. When Matteo arrived at his house and tried to get in, Filippo impersonated his voice from behind closed doors and ordered him to go away. Confused, Manetto wandered the streets of Florence, where many individuals started addressing him as Matteo. It wasn't long before a bailiff arrested him for being Matteo, under the charge of not paying his debts. Manetto protested that he wasn't Matteo, but even as he was put in prison for the night, his fellow prisoners, all of them party of Filippo's prank, addressed him by his alien name. Certain this misunderstanding would soon be cleared up, Manetto was stunned when the brothers of the real Matteo came to bail him out and also addressed him as Matteo. They even took him home to Matteo's house and put him to sleep with a potion supplied by Filippo. Later into the night, they carried him back to his own home. Awaking in the morning, the carpenter was confused because his entire home was rearranged. All of his tools were in completely different places. And then there was a knock at the door. It was Matteo's brothers, but this time they treated him differently, and told him of a curious story of how the previous evening their brother Matteo conceived this fantastic notion that he was someone else. Matteo himself soon arrived and confirmed their story, how he had the most vivid dream of being a carpenter. He told Manetto that he had spent his time as a carpenter rearranging his home and tools. Faced with this evidence, Manetto became more convinced than ever that, for a while at least, he had exchanged identities with Matteo. Falling victim of Brunelleschi's ingenious practical joke, Manetto left Florence, humiliated and confused. His story immortalized as the tale of the Fat Woodworker, which went on and gained status of legend in Florence.
No doubt this story has been exaggerated over the course of time, but In general, historians agree that it is grounded in concrete historical facts. And what it tells us is that Brunelleschi was no ordinary man. To even pull off half of this practical joke takes a very calculating, cunning, and manipulative personality, and one of great influence amongst his peers, many of which frequented the upper-class circles of society. Arriving in the wasteland of Rome with Brunelleschi was the adolescent Donatello, who would not only go on to be remembered as one of the most prominent sculptors of the Renaissance, but was also of a cunning and hot-tempered disposition, just like Brunelleschi. As Ross King recounts, at the age of 15, Donatello landed himself in trouble with magistrates in Pistoia for striking a German over the head with a large stick. And many years later he would travel to Ferrara, intent upon murdering one of his runaway apprentices. If one of Donatello's rich patrons refused to pay the full price for a statue, Donatello would demolish it in a fit of temper. Just like the book hunters, the humanist architects and sculptors of the time were not just learned innovators with a taste for aesthetics. They were calculating, greedy, ambitious, narcissistic, and borderline criminal. And what were these two, Brunelleschi and Donatello, doing exactly when they arrived in the wastelands of Rome? Well, no one really knows.
The two young men lived like vagabonds, paying little attention to what they ate, how they dressed, or where they slept. Together, they began digging among the vast ruins, hiring porters to cart away the rubble, and becoming known to the locals as the treasure hunters, because it was believed they were searching for gold coins and other treasures. Their activity may have attracted suspicion and even fear among the Christian residents, not merely because they were suspected of practicing geomancy, the art of divining the future by interpreting the patterns made by handfuls of earth, but because pagan fragments of ruins were considered bad luck. What is most suspicious, however, is that what exactly Filippo saw in these excavations was unknown even to Donatello, his partner.
As if book hunting or book forging wasn't enough during the Renaissance, we also had humanists travelling far and wide, treasure seeking, in much the same vein. The Italian nobility, the elites, the Medici, the Pitti, the Orsini, offered no less than a fortune for excavated classical ruins, fragments, and statues. And the exchange of these items fueled a lively, antique business, so much so that the act of treasure seeking continued well into the 1500s. Michelangelo, one of the later, most influential humanists, who specialized in sculpting, painting, and architecture, was directly involved in this antique economy, and, despite his name, Michelangelo was no angel. When he was only 14 years of age, Michelangelo was sent by his tutor, a master in fresco painting, to none other than Lorenzo di Medici, at his request. Recognizing his talent, Medici quickly took the young Michelangelo under his wing, bestowing him patronage and enrolling him in the Platonic Academy, a humanist school founded by Medici. It was during this time that Michelangelo produced a series of unbelievably impressive sculptures. The Faun, the Battle of the Centaurs, the Madonna of the Stairs, and the Sleeping Cupid. The Sleeping Cupid, now lost to the world, was not always ascribed to Michelangelo's talents. It was originally sold as an antique of the ancient world. It was claimed to be at least 1,000 years older than it actually was. Historians argue on how, exactly, the statue was aged. In one version of the story, Michelangelo artificially aged his statue using acidic earth. According to Vasari, it was the art dealer who buried it in a vineyard that he has there. It was sold to the very wealthy and very powerful Cardinal Riario, who upon learning later it was a forgery, became extremely angry, before quickly softening at the realization of a great opportunity. Or, as scholar Lynn Catterson writes, he came to the other side of the fence, as it were, as a sponsor of the next one, the next forgery. And why would the Cardinal, if he had been duped, change his mind and become an additional sponsor of Michelangelo? Noah Charney, art professor and author of The Art of Forgery, downplays this decision when he explains that the ability to mimic Roman sculpture was a sign of ability in the Renaissance. What the Cardinal and other elites were actually doing was seizing upon the opportunity to use young talent to make a fortune, most likely out of selling forgeries wrongly ascribed to the ancient world. Did Medici really just want to encourage young talent, or did he see a great opportunity in Michelangelo? After all, for the Cupid, as Catterson writes, the sponsor must have been Lorenzo Medici, since he contacted the dealer and set up the transaction. Was Medici's patronage actually a grooming act of a young adolescent? A grooming act that would not only make Medici a fortune, but also strengthen the ongoing potential fraudulent operation of book hunting. The manner in which the transaction of the Cupid was carried out suggests so. As Catterson explains,
the sculpture was initially funded and then turned over to a dealer, a middleman who could testify to its antique origins in order to resell the object, while at the same time displacing dubious intent from the sponsor or sculptor.
Just as the book hunters or forgers were very careful to cover their tracks, using middlemen here disconnected the artist and sponsor with the act of forgery. And while Vasari claims that it was the art dealer himself who buried the statue and aged it, Michelangelo's record and reputation suggests otherwise. There were early signs of both the disposition to make forgeries as well as fairly high career ambitions. Already as an apprentice, Michelangelo counterfeited drawings of various old masters, returning the copy to the owner instead of the original. Michelangelo's copies could not be distinguished from the originals, since he smoked and tinted the paper to give it an appearance of age. This aptitude for forgery and theft leads Catterson to believe that much of Michelangelo's earliest works in sculpture might really be classified as forgeries. But Catterson really muddies the waters of accepted history when she proposes that the infamous Laocoon, an alleged masterpiece from the ancient world, might not only be a forgery, but also done at the hands of Michelangelo himself. The discovery of Laocoon has many elements that seem too good to be true. Just like the book hunter, for the successful treasure seeker, acclaim was instantaneous, propelling them to the upper echelons of society. Catterson's first suspicion is that despite being lost for almost 1,500 years, it was discovered in an excellent physical state, which was noted at the time to be relatively whole and in good condition. Wikipedia states that it was excavated in Rome in 1506, but this is not entirely correct. The sculpture was not found buried in the ground, but rather discovered in an underground room in a vineyard, and was identified immediately as a Laocoon. It's a similar tale as those discoveries of books in unlikely places such as dark dungeons. What's also very familiar is how the humanists even knew about a lost statue called Laocoon in the first place. Just like the way intertextuality, the way writers and texts refer to other writers and texts, may have ensured the longevity of a potential fraudulent business of book hunting, many of those ancient books also referenced in passing classical artworks, sculptures, and architectural structures. And it was the work of Pliny, an alleged ancient Roman, that describes a Laocoon statue as a work superior to all pictures and bronzes of the world. But as Catterson notes, the statue discovered in the underground room did not correspond perfectly with Pliny's description. The rediscovered statue was composed of 7 pieces of marble, whereas Pliny described it as having been carved from 1. And it's this composite nature to the statue that Catterson sees as another major red flag.
Even more incredible was that none of the several joins were visibly obvious, but rather were fused in such hidden places and so well consolidated and plastered together that only the greatest experts in this art can readily recognize them. In other words, this large marble multi-figure sculptural group had not even loosened up over the more than 1,500 years that its age was believed to be.
Despite this, when it was discovered, it was recognized immediately to be the one described by Pliny, and no doubts occurred due to its composite structuring. No question raised about its stealthy joining of 7 marble pieces and not being carved from one sole block. In the exact same way that intertextual references to other, yet-to-be-discovered books would have worked to keep a fraudulent book-hunting enterprise alive, it would have also driven and given authenticity to a counterfeit antique market, allowing treasure seekers to forge pieces of art referenced in other books, and then secretly age, hide, and then subsequently discover them. Catterson also notes that during the period leading up to the rediscovery of the Laocoon, there is evidence of Michelangelo procuring surplus marble. And following the discovery of the Laocoon, a case could be made that Michelangelo was especially edgy and secretive. 2 weeks after the event, Michelangelo wrote home to his father, requesting he send him a bag of drawings. He was so anxious that he wrote another letter for someone to double check. I wrote to him telling him to put that chest of mine in a safe place under cover, and then to come here to Rome immediately, and on no account to fail to do this. I don't know what he has done. Please will you put him in mind of this? Also, would you please put yourself to a little trouble over the following 2 things. That is, in having that chest of mine put under cover in a safe place. The other is that marble of Our Lady. I want you to have it moved into the house, likewise, and not let anyone see it. Were it just the marble of Our Lady that he wanted hidden, Catterson asks. We might interpret this as a case of the artist not wishing for anyone to see his work in progress. And what was in the chest? Was it those drawings he was worried about? Perhaps his initial work in progress designs of Laocoon, or perhaps even correspondence pertaining to its forgery or location of discovery? We'll never know. The morning after he died in Rome, a commission was sent to perform an inventory of the sculptor's possessions. Much to the disappointment of many, including the Duke Cosimo Medici, Michelangelo left behind only a few cartoons and no drawings. It was revealed that the sculptor had burned them all in 2 lots just before his death. The extremity of the action has made some feel that Michelangelo was attempting to hide something, even offering the suggestion that the burned drawings were lascivious. But again, and in the end, burning drawings that had been executed as studies for counterfeits would make perfect sense. But perhaps Catterson is giving Michelangelo too much credit. Perhaps he didn't burn them at all. There was, after all, a commission to perform an inventory upon the announcement of his death. Perhaps Medici and other sponsors involved in the fraudulent business of counterfeit antiques were anxious that all correspondence of any kind that could betray their actions were destroyed or forever hidden. Michelangelo's forgeries not only testify, once again, to the criminal nature underpinning the activity of the humanists, but it also strengthens the unreliability surrounding ancient artifacts. To this day, the debate surrounding the authorship continues as to whether the Laocoon is actually a Greek original or a later Roman copy. In other words, and despite the fact that it is the most famous and canonical extant example of classical antiquity, we are not really sure exactly what it is. Could many other classical structures ascribed to antiquity be counterfeit products of the Renaissance? Just like the rediscovered books, it is extremely difficult to prove or disprove that so-called ancient artifacts are indeed forgeries. And what was Brunelleschi doing in the wastelands of Rome that even his partner, Donatello, was not aware of? His contemporary biographer, Antonio Manetti, claims that Filippo, secretive as ever, made his study of ancient ruins while pretending to be doing something else. He inscribed on strips of parchment a series of cryptic symbols and Arabic numbers, a secret code. What did he return to Florence with? And could this trip have something to do with this? All paths will soon converge, but first it is necessary to examine the wasteland.